I need to tell you about a decision that has been weighing on my mind for months. A decision that wasn't made lightly, wasn't made in anger, and wasn't made for the reasons most people would assume. It's a decision that reveals something troubling about what's happening in America right now, especially to people like you. Drop a comment below and write "Truth Matters" if you're ready to hear why this decision became necessary and what it means for older Americans who are watching the direction our country is heading. Here's what I've been observing about how America treats its most experienced citizens, and why these observations led to a choice I never thought I'd have to make. For years, I've been building companies, creating jobs, and trying to contribute to America's technological leadership and economic strength. But throughout this journey, I've noticed something deeply disturbing about how our society views and treats people who have decades of experience and wisdom to offer. I've watched as brilliant engineers and executives in their 60s and 70s are pushed aside for fresh perspectives and digital natives, regardless of their continued competence and valuable institutional knowledge. I've seen how healthcare systems, government agencies, and even families treat older adults as burdens to be managed rather than resources to be valued. I've observed how our culture has developed an almost pathological obsession with youth, treating aging as a disease rather than an achievement, and experience as obsolescence rather than wisdom. This isn't just unfortunate, it's economically destructive and morally wrong. In my companies, I've made it a point to retain and value older employees because I understand what they bring to the table. They have perspective that can't be taught in schools, problem-solving skills developed through decades of real-world experience, and emotional intelligence that comes only from having navigated many different challenges and changes. But I've been fighting an uphill battle against a culture that systematically devalues these qualities. I've watched talented older workers struggle to find employment despite their capabilities. I've seen older Americans marginalized in public discourse, treated as if their opinions matter less because they're not part of the connected generation. Most disturbing, I've witnessed how this ageism has become so normalized that even older Americans themselves have internalized it. They apologize for taking up space, hesitate to share their opinions, and withdraw from public life because they've been convinced that their time of relevance has passed. This cultural hostility toward aging and experience isn't just cruel, it's incredibly wasteful. America is throwing away one of its most valuable resources, the accumulated wisdom and experience of millions of people who have lived through multiple economic cycles, technological transitions, and social changes. These observations became more than just philosophical concerns for me when I realized how this cultural dysfunction was affecting my ability to build sustainable organizations and contribute to long-term progress. When a society consistently undervalues experience and wisdom, it becomes harder to make decisions that require long-term thinking and patience. The breaking point came when I witnessed how the pandemic response treated older Americans not as citizens whose wisdom and perspective were needed during a crisis, but as problems to be managed and protected by younger people who supposedly knew better. The dismissive attitude toward older voices during this critical period revealed something deeply wrong with our cultural priorities. I watched as policy decisions were made without adequate input from people who had lived through previous pandemics, economic crises, and social upheavals. The arrogance of assuming that technology and youth could substitute for experience and wisdom led to mistakes that could have been avoided. But it wasn't just the pandemic response. It was the broader pattern of a society that had lost respect for its elders, that treated aging as failure rather than achievement, that valued innovation over wisdom and speed over depth. This cultural hostility creates an environment where it becomes increasingly difficult to build anything that requires long-term thinking, institutional memory, or the kind of patience that only comes with experience. When a society is constantly throwing away its accumulated knowledge in favor of the latest trends, it becomes harder to make real progress. These weren't just abstract concerns for me. They became painfully personal when I started paying attention to what was happening to talented people in my own orbit. People whose potential was being wasted because of arbitrary age-based assumptions. The tech industry, which I've been part of for decades, has become particularly toxic in this regard. I've watched brilliant engineers forced into early retirement because they weren't seen as culturally fit for companies obsessed with hiring 20-somethings. I've seen investors pass on promising startups founded by experienced entrepreneurs simply because the founders weren't young enough to fit the Silicon Valley stereotype. But what really opened my eyes was a hiring meeting I sat in on about 2 years ago. We were reviewing candidates for a senior engineering position, a role that required deep technical knowledge and the kind of judgment that comes from having solved similar problems before. One of the candidates was a 67-year-old woman named Elena, who had more relevant experience than anyone else we interviewed. She had spent 30 years working on exactly the kinds of systems we were building. She had solved problems that our younger engineers were still figuring out how to approach. Her technical interview scores were outstanding. During the internal discussion after her interview, I watched several people dismiss her candidacy with barely disguised age discrimination. "She might not adapt to our fast-paced culture," one person said. "She probably isn't comfortable with our collaborative workspace design," said another. "We need someone who can grow with the company long-term," said a third, as if her potential contributions were somehow less valuable because she might not work for 30 more years. The most revealing comment came from a hiring manager in his 30s who said, "I just think we need someone who can relate better to the rest of the team." When I pressed him on what he meant, he couldn't articulate any specific concern about Elena's ability to work with others. He just felt that her age made her somehow incompatible with younger colleagues. I found myself in the position of having to argue for hiring the most qualified candidate against a room full of people who were letting unconscious bias override objective evaluation. Elena was eventually hired, but only after I made it clear that I considered the age-based objections unacceptable. What happened next proved everything I had suspected about the value of experience. Elena didn't just excel in her role, she transformed how our entire engineering team approached problem solving. She had a way of seeing patterns and potential issues that the younger engineers missed. She could predict where certain technical approaches would lead to problems months or years down the road. More importantly, Elena became an informal mentor to several younger team members, sharing knowledge and perspective that they couldn't get from textbooks or online courses. She helped them understand not just how to implement solutions, but how to think about the long-term consequences of their technical choices. Elena also brought a different perspective to team dynamics. She had experience managing stress, handling conflict, and maintaining focus during challenging projects that proved invaluable when the team faced serious difficulties. While younger team members sometimes got caught up in drama or politics, Elena helped maintain perspective and keep everyone focused on what really mattered. But here's what struck me most about Elena's situation. When I later talked to her about her job search experience, she revealed that she had been looking for work for over a year before we hired her. Despite her exceptional qualifications, most companies wouldn't even grant her an interview once they saw her age. Elena told me that she had started to question her own abilities because of the consistent rejection she faced. I began to wonder if I really was obsolete. She said, "When everyone treats you like your knowledge is worthless, you start to believe it yourself." This conversation was a turning point for me. I realized that the waste of human potential I was witnessing wasn't just about individual companies making poor hiring decisions. It was about a systematic cultural pattern that was convincing experienced, capable people that they had nothing valuable to contribute. Elena's story made me understand that this wasn't just an economic problem, it was a human tragedy playing out millions of times across the country. Talented, knowledgeable people in their 60s, 70s, and beyond were being told by society that their time was over, that their experience was irrelevant, that they should step aside for younger people. This realization led me to start looking more carefully at the broader patterns. I began noticing how older Americans were being marginalized not just in the workplace, but in public discourse, in family decisions, in community leadership roles. The message was consistent. Your time has passed, your opinions don't matter, your experience is outdated. The more I observed these patterns, the more I understood that they weren't just unfair to older Americans. They were undermining America's ability to make wise decisions about anything. When you systematically exclude the people with the most experience and perspective from important conversations, you end up making decisions based on incomplete information and limited understanding. This insight eventually led me to a decision I never thought I would have to make. After months of wrestling with these observations and their implications, I decided to temporarily relocate my primary residence outside of America. This wasn't about giving up on American ideals or abandoning the country I've called home for decades. It was about gaining the distance needed to think clearly about how to address these cultural problems more effectively. Sometimes you have to step outside a dysfunctional system to understand how to help fix it. The decision became clear when I realized that I was spending more time fighting against cultural dysfunction than working on solutions. The constant need to defend the value of experience, to argue against age discrimination, to justify long-term thinking in an environment obsessed with immediate results, this was consuming energy that could be better used elsewhere. Let me tell you about someone who understood this principle long before I did, someone whose story illustrates both the problem and a potential solution. Her name is Catherine, and she's 74 years old. Catherine spent 40 years as a city planner, helping design and implement infrastructure projects that improved millions of people's lives. She understood better than almost anyone how cities grow, change, and adapt over time. Her expertise was built on decades of observing what works and what doesn't in urban development. When Catherine retired 5 years ago, she expected to be consulted occasionally on major planning decisions. After all, she had institutional memory that couldn't be replaced and insights that could only come from having seen multiple development cycles play out over decades. Instead, Catherine discovered that the planning department had no interest in her knowledge or experience. The new generation of planners, fresh out of graduate school with the latest theories and technologies, treated her accumulated wisdom as outdated thinking that was no longer relevant. Catherine watched as the city made planning decisions that she knew from experience would create problems in 10 or 15 years. When she tried to share her concerns, she was politely dismissed as someone who was stuck in the past and didn't understand modern approaches to urban development. The younger planners were brilliant and well-educated, but they had no context for understanding how their innovations might interact with existing systems, how communities actually respond to change over time, or what unintended consequences their plans might create. Catherine could see problems developing that would be expensive and difficult to fix later, but her warnings were ignored because they came from someone who was perceived as being from a previous era rather than the current one. Frustrated by this dismissive attitude, Catherine began documenting her observations and predictions. She created detailed analyses of current planning decisions, explaining what problems she expected to emerge and when. She shared these analyses with local news outlets and community organizations. Over the next 3 years, many of Catherine's predictions proved accurate. Projects that had been celebrated as innovative solutions began creating exactly the problems she had warned about. Infrastructure investments that looked smart in the short term started showing their limitations as they interacted with existing systems in ways the younger planners hadn't anticipated. Gradually, some city officials began to recognize the value of Catherine's perspective. They started consulting her informally on major decisions, not because they had suddenly developed respect for aging, but because her track record of accurate predictions had proved the practical value of her experience. Catherine's vindication was satisfying, but it came too late to prevent several costly mistakes that could have been avoided if her expertise had been valued from the beginning. The problem isn't that young people don't know things, Catherine told me. The problem is that they don't know what they don't know, and our culture has taught them that experience and institutional memory are liabilities rather than assets. They're making decisions in a vacuum because we've convinced ourselves that wisdom is just another word for being out of touch. Catherine's story illustrates the broader cultural problem that influenced my decision to seek some distance from the American environment. When a society systematically devalues experience and wisdom, it becomes much harder to make good long-term decisions about anything. This devaluation doesn't just hurt older Americans personally, it hurts everyone by wasting accumulated knowledge and creating environments where the same mistakes get repeated because institutional memory has been discarded. The time I'm spending outside America isn't about abandoning American ideals or giving up on American potential. It's about gaining the perspective needed to understand how to address these cultural problems more effectively. From this distance, I can see more clearly how other societies handle the relationship between innovation and experience, between progress and wisdom, between youth and age. I can observe different models for valuing older citizens and learn from approaches that might be applicable to American challenges. Most importantly, I can think more clearly about how to build organizations and systems that benefit from the full range of human experience rather than just the narrow slice that happens to be fashionable at any given moment. The companies I've built will continue to employ thousands of Americans and invest in American infrastructure. The distance is temporary and strategic, not permanent and emotional. But this perspective has already helped me understand things about American culture that were harder to see when I was completely immersed in it. One thing that's become clear is that America's treatment of older citizens isn't just a social justice issue, it's an economic competitiveness issue. Countries that better integrate older workers and value accumulated experience are better positioned to make sustainable long-term decisions. Another insight is that the cult of youth and innovation isn't actually producing better outcomes, it's just producing faster changes, some of which turn out to be improvements and others of which turn out to be expensive mistakes that could have been avoided with more input from experienced voices. The most important realization is that this cultural dysfunction isn't inevitable or unchangeable. It's a set of attitudes and practices that developed for specific historical reasons and can be modified as those reasons become less relevant. But changing these patterns requires people who understand both the value of innovation and the value of experience. It requires leaders who can bridge generational differences rather than exploit them. It requires a cultural shift that sees aging as achievement rather than decline. This is work that needs to be done by people who understand both the American tradition of innovation and the universal human value of accumulated wisdom. It's work that requires the kind of long-term thinking that becomes easier when you're not constantly fighting against short-term pressures and cultural hostility. My temporary relocation has given me the space to think about these challenges without the daily frustration of fighting against them. It's allowed me to develop strategies for addressing them that might be more effective than direct confrontation with dysfunctional patterns. The goal isn't to escape from American problems, but to approach them with renewed energy and clearer perspectives. Sometimes you have to step outside a system to understand how to fix it. What I've learned during this time away has only reinforced my belief that America's ageism problem is solvable, but it requires intentional action from people who understand both the scope of the challenge and the value of what's being wasted. I've been studying how other countries handle the integration of older workers and citizens into their economic and social systems. Places like Japan and Germany have developed cultural practices and policy frameworks that better recognize the value of experience while still encouraging innovation. They've found ways to bridge generational differences rather than exploit them. These observations have helped me understand that America's current dysfunction around aging isn't inevitable or permanent. It's a relatively recent cultural development that can be changed with the right approaches. But change requires leadership from people who see the problem clearly and are willing to work on solutions systematically. This is why Elena's story matters so much to me. She represents millions of Americans whose talents are being wasted because of arbitrary cultural biases. But she also represents the solution. When organizations actually utilize experienced talent effectively, everyone benefits. The younger workers learn faster, projects are completed more successfully, and institutions build the kind of stability that allows for sustainable growth. My temporary distance from the daily pressures of American business culture has allowed me to develop strategies for creating more age-inclusive organizations and advocating for policies that recognize the economic value of experienced workers. It's given me the perspective needed to approach these challenges more systematically rather than just fighting individual battles as they arise. Share this with someone who has felt undervalued because of their age and needs to understand that the problem isn't with them, it's with a culture that has lost sight of the value of experience and wisdom. Subscribe if you believe that America's treatment of older citizens reflects deeper cultural problems that hurt everyone and that solving these problems requires both innovation and wisdom. What's one way you've seen ageism waste valuable experience and knowledge in your community?